Well, and thank you all for being here today. The West is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. I have this great love of the West, and I confess it to everyone. I have the image of the West. I have my experiences in camping all across the West. When my daughter was growing up, we camped in actually all 48 contiguous states, but we spent a lot of summers camping for 5, 6 weeks at a time out West from the Canadian border all the way to Arizona and New Mexico, which is a little hot in the summertime. But I have this fascination with the West, and I always loved teaching it. And I kind of teamed up with one of my friends years ago when I was teaching, and we did sort of a class that was called Heroes and Outlaws, and it was great, great fun. So when I put this on the thing, I thought, we all have this image of the wild, wild West, some of which is true, and a lot of it is myth. It's sort of like when you think about American folklore and you think about Pecos Bill, or you think about Paul Bunyan or Slewfoot Sue, or these sort of mythological characters, and we almost in that way have this image of the wild, wild West. Even that period of ranching and homesteading and all of that, and we sense that it was a huge part of our expansion, and it was, but the reality is it's for a short period of time. At 1860s, you have some beginning, and by the late 1880s, basically that claiming of the West is over for the most part. So it's relatively a short period in history. I think one of the things that has always fascinated us as an American society is there's been so much concentration with film and art and music and everything that kind of focused our attention on the West. So, I grew up, and I won't ask you to raise your hand and admit it too, but I grew up watching Roy Rogers and Gene Autry and a lot of John Wayne movies that had to do with the West. I grew up also, we were laughing that I should have background music to this, and it could be from Gunsmoke or Bonanza or Laredo or High Chaparral or program Wanted Dead or Alive. I mean, you think about in the 60s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, so much of television programming concentrated on the West. And I've read analysis of that time period that because it was such a tense period for us as a society, Cold War, the potential of confrontation with the Soviet Union, that the stories of the Wild West was sort of this way of portraying good versus evil. You have the gunslingers, you have, the settlers circling their wagons and being attacked and everything. Well, so much of that image is not exactly the true historical image. So we're going to actually spend 2 weeks talking about the West. If you have looked at the calendar, I had originally planned that there would be no class on March 29th and no class on April the 5th. And that was because I had decided I was going to Eastern Europe. I was headed off to Vienna, to Prague, to Budapest. Haven't traveled in a number of years. I'm not going to Vienna, Prague, and Budapest because my tour has been canceled because of so much of the unrest that's going on in Eastern Europe, and I'm sure the concerns that it could spill over into some sort of conflict. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do half of the Old West. We're going to do the other half next week. And then on March 29th, there will be no class. That's spring break for a lot of the kids here in Hamilton County. And so I'm headed to Reelfoot Lake camping with my 2 younger grandkids to see eagles. But we will have class on April the 5th, and we'll update all of that on the website. So let's talk the Wild Wild West for just a little bit. And so let's move on to our first slide. And I really do want to kind of do some background information. And so there are a few facts that I want us to think about because I don't know. Some of this I think I understood. Some of it I became acquainted with when I took, westward expansion history, when I took an 1870s to 1890s class on the Western frontier. But I think we don't hear it a lot in our culture, and that's that really the westward expansion, we can talk about Jefferson and buying the Louisiana Purchase and sending Lewis and Clark, which we have talked about, to explore the region. We can talk about certainly the Spanish influence because the Spanish are there by the 1500s, coming up through Mexico and into the Southwest in particular, but also into the regions, Florida, along the coast, the Gulf Coast, Texas, and that area. And we have this mixing of cultures, but we really began to seriously look west after the Civil War. You'll remember that when the Civil War began, and we were talking about that only last week, Kansas and Nebraska come in, those are triggers to the American Civil War. So we really, a lot of that is still territory. We haven't done a lot with it. Well, one of the facts that I do want you to remember is that once the railroads are completed to the west, that begins to open the land up for two things: for settlement, but economic development, and economic development in mining, and what natural resources are there that can be used to promote. And when we come back on April the 5th, we're going to be talking about the second industrial revolution, and a lot of those resources are going to come from the west because there was such a plentiful source. The second thing is that once we have the railroads there, in addition to the overland passes that people could use going by wagon train or whatever, the Civil War, I think, brought people to a realization that there were just troubles, and it wasn't going to go away just because there had been a surrender at Appomattox, and Joe Johnson eventually surrenders in the Carolinas, and you got John Bell Hood and some of them surrendering in Texas. So a lot of people saw the end of the Civil War as a reason to go farther west to be able to claim land. We had the gold rush that started in 1849, but we're going to have wave after wave of mining ideas, things that silver and bauxite and all copper mines and all this different mining, in addition to gold mining, that brings people to the west. And then you have this westward expansion, a lot of it coming out of the South initially. There's a difference between farming and ranching, and yet there's some overlap in all of them, but you're going to have this move toward huge ranches. And that's because while we're so used to, maybe here in the South, rich grass, especially Kentucky bluegrass, where you have tremendous pasture land, the West is going to be more sparse. It's not going to produce the same amount of grass. So ranches are going to be much larger, and it's not going to be uncommon for people to have ranches of 2 and 3 and 4 and 5,000 acres. That's not what you find in the South. That's not what you find at this point, even in the early Midwest. One of the things that history tells us too, number 3 on my list, is a huge migration of former slaves and free African ethnicity individuals who are going to move to the West, because there was a lot of promotion of creating all Black Western towns. And the idea that in all Black towns, segregated towns for those who were of African American ethnicity, that it would be a heaven on earth, because it would be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people of the same ethnicity. And that's intriguing. History books nowadays talk about that. For a long time, there wasn't a lot of discussion about that. Those of you that maybe grew up with Blazing Saddles, I can't see your faces, but some of you probably have seen Blazing Saddles, which is, one of those tongue-in-cheek, hilarious sort of satire. I mean, just wild. But the Cleavon Little character, who's going to be a rancher and everything, some of that is a takeoff on that. The other thing that when we think about the West, is a little bit of what I'll talk about today, is we, for the first time, begin to have the addition of ethnicity into the West from the Far East. We didn't have, when you look at the 13 colonies in westward expansion to Kansas, Nebraska, and all that, predominantly European immigration, but we get to this period of time and we begin first with the Chinese coming, and then we will have some of the other ethnicities coming. I saw a question pop up. Were there any all Black towns? There were a few. They didn't last long, but there were a few. Some of them will be attempts by some of the former Buffalo soldiers, even in the 1880s, as they're coming out of the military, to create those sorts of ranch community towns that are all Black. But it again becomes a question of grabbing the land, and that becomes an issue. But it's a fascinating study to look at. It's one of those things I've often thought I will write about sometime when I make myself sit down enough to write about it, because there's so much history that we just don't talk about. The next slide will tell you some of the other things that you kind of have to have in the back of your mind when you think about this level of westward expansion. And, I think I grew up seeing the movies where, the settlers or the men on the train, the train would be going by and they would be shooting the bison. And I don't know that we had a movie that really sort of looked at that westward expansion where you have the huge herds of bison wiped out, until Kevin Costner created Dances with Wolves, and you suddenly had the other perspective. And it's so difficult to look back 125, 130 years hindsight. I don't know, other than, you think about a few of the writers that were Ramona, Helen Hunt Jackson, some of the authors that sort of wrote from the vantage point of the Native people. I think there was such a strong sense of manifest destiny that we didn't think about. I mean, I'm sure there were people who did, but as a nation, we did not take into consideration what almost wiping out the bison would do to the Native Americans, because quite frankly, the government did not look at the Native Americans as being, certainly they were not citizens. And, in many pieces of legislation, they are considered to be, and it's horrifying to say it now, but they were considered to be a step above cattle, not truly human in the way that just almost chokes my breath to say that, but it's a case. And we're going to look at a couple of things that sort of tell us about some of those interactions and those stories. One of the other things that's interesting today, we talk about native plants and restoring and all of that, is we think about the natural grasses, because that Midwest area, tall grasses that own that what would really be plateau, almost tundra sorts of prairie grasses and all those native plants. And by the 1880s, an awful lot of that native grass has been destroyed, and we plowed under the grasses, and we are planting wheat, and we're planting corn, and we're planting barley, and we're planting crops that sustain an increasing national population. We'll talk a little bit about that with one of the slides that I have for you. But, we weren't thinking about native versus invasive. Not that wheat is an invasive species, but, we all know the stories of, at times, introducing what we think are helpful forms of vegetation, only to find out that it's kudzu and it may not be quite as helpful as we think it is. And then one of the things too is that you have this cattle industry. Once there are railroads, we become much more of a meat-based society, because the cattle industry will increase significantly because they can get hoofs to market. They can get to the stockyards in Chicago and the other big, huge centers where they have the slaughterhouses. They can, they can process the cattle, and we find ourselves eating much more beef than we'd eaten before. We find, huge farms with swine, just this idea of mutton, even with the sheep farmers that are going to be in the Midwest. we're going to find our diet changing significantly, because the majority of people only ate meat 1 meal a week, and the rest of the time you were pretty much vegetables. But as we have easier access to meat, we become a meat-based people. I was doing a class, in fact, last Tuesday afternoon after this class at the Medal of Honor with our history club, and I was talking about in World War II how nationally there was a declaration of meatless Mondays, and I had several of the kids go, "You mean not even a hamburger? I mean, not steak, not roast, but not even chicken?" Well, no, actually, technically, chicken was considered to be a meat. But it's funny because we now just assume there'll be meat on the table. Number 6 on the list, it's hard for us to really reconcile how westward expansion, how it impacted the Native American people who were there, other than to say that the numbers are going to drastically dwindle. And by drastically dwindle, I mean there are going to be measures that will limit population, but there's also going to be just simply the number of wars that break out, massacres that we know about now in history. And while treaties have been made in many cases to move some of those people to the West, or to move them onto particular parts of the West, we're going to find that when, in some cases, that land becomes desirable land by settlers coming from the East, of course, those treaties are going to be violated. And there really wasn't a good forum. You know, many times representatives of the major Native tribes, where it's the Lakota or the Apache or the Navajo or whomever, are going to go to Washington and ask for an audience, and they will receive an audience, but not much is going to be done to preserve their lands for their use, because the assumption is that might makes right, really. Number 7, you know, this image, the cowboy becomes the iconic symbol of the West, and yet the reality is the cowboy that we think of as roping, and there are still cowboys today who are on the ranches, but that is a lifestyle for a huge percentage of the population, is a very limited time period. But we have these images of the cowboys and the cattle trails and yippee-ki-yay and, you know, get along little doggy and all the Western songs and the guitars and the horses and the chuck wagons. And, you know, it's just kind of fascinating. Of course, along with that come the gunslingers. I'll show you a couple of pictures of well-known gunslingers a little bit later, but it really is kind of fascinating. We used to say that the West was just an outlet for Eastern citizens who, you know, it was a pressure valve almost, as life got too intense and there were too many people around, you could go west and start all over again, and that we had this built-in opportunity to recreate yourself time after time after time. And some of us have families that we look at that, you know, one of my family lines comes out of Virginia, they come into North Carolina, they come into Tennessee, they drop off my branch of the family. My great-great-grandparents and my great-grandparents on that line are buried in Texas, but then members of that family went on to New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada. So, you know, you kind of see that sometimes in family histories. But the truth of the matter is the West really becomes a crossroads, because you do have other ethnicities coming in. It's a much more intense, where you're going to see, you know, the Chinese, eventually the Japanese coming in, some Koreans, you're going to see Russians coming in. We don't talk about that a lot, but there's quite a bit, because at one point Russia claimed all the way down into what today is California. So, okay. And I'm looking at the clock and thinking, oh my gracious. So let's hit just some things that are kind of interesting facts to know. So I think you can look and see, as in 1862, we're all concentrating on the American Civil War. I mean, we have reached that realization after the firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, when everyone thought the war would be over in 6 weeks. By the way, there are so many wars throughout history where everyone goes, you know, 6 weeks, it'll be over, you know, is so much stronger than the other and it'll be over. Well, we realized by 1862, the war is not going to be over in 6 weeks. In fact, the war is pretty intense. But at the same time, Congress is really dealing with some issues other than just funding the Union Army. So 1862, you'll notice they passed the Homestead Act, and the Homestead Act allowed you to settle on public land, move westward, settle on public land, 160 acres, which is, for people coming especially from the South, from Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, which had farming histories, 160 acres is a good piece of land. And you could claim that land. You basically did not pay for it, but what you had to do was to make improvements. And the improvements could be as little as building a home on it. And of course, what we realized as we began to move westward into that Midwestern region, it did not have the plentiful hardwood forest that you saw here, nor did it have, the evergreen forest or anything. So you're going to have a lot of sod houses built. The stamp that you see is an actual stamp that was issued in 1962 as the 100th anniversary. I'm a stamp collector, so I kind of like to throw those up. But you see, building a sod house qualified as making improvement on the land. And once you did that and you stayed on the land for 5 years, it was yours. So that's when you began to have a lot of people think, I'm going west. I'm going to do this. I don't know what it means. I don't exactly know how to prepare for it, which is why you'll have people organizing wagon trains, and you'll have particular trails that will kind of help lead people that way, whether it's the Oregon Trail or the Mormon Trail or others that will lead us westward. So next slide, as we kind of walk through it and take a look at it. 1864 is often considered to be a pivotal year as we talk about westward expansion, because that's when the Montana Territory comes in as territory. They have enough people to be a territory. They're not a state yet. Nevada has enough people to become a state. Now, Utah is already in that process. You have Congress passing the Second Pacific Railroad Act. So they're looking at a transcontinental railroad. We're not going to drive that golden spike until 1869, but they're putting the money into it because a railroad that would go all the way from the east to the Pacific, they see as opening up the entire West to economic development and settlement. And then you have, as we begin to expand, as we move into that region, we have encounters with the native people in that area. Now, one of the tragedies that I will mention to you, the Navajo were not warlike people. The Navajo, for the most part, were sheep herders, farmers, grazers. They were not, they're not warriors. That was not their background. They are much more into arts and culture and all those sorts of things. But we have a situation that occurs in 1864 where Kit Carson, and most of us know Kit Carson is one of in fact, he's often called the great pathfinder, opens the West and everything. But in opening the West, some of the land that was potentially going to be good for farming was land owned by the Navajo. The Navajo were, the government was attempting to move them to a reservation sort of situation where they had a limited amount of dry, not necessarily good farming land. And they're not wanting to move. And you have Kit Carson and his military forces, because Kit Carson has been a scout for the military. And there's a conflict that results in almost 2,000. Then they have the war against the Navajo, and then you actually have about 2,000 of the Cheyenne that are going to be killed by the Fighting Parson at Glorieta Pass. And suddenly the Western newspapers are filled with stories of native people, sort of lumping them all together, who are attacking the settlers. And in some cases, that's true. I mean, that had been true in Kentucky. Daniel Boone lost, a son, and other members of his expedition even coming into Kentucky. But it's going to be portrayed in the media without a consideration that that land had been their land before. And it's a difficult thing to talk about now. John Chivington is going to use as his argument, he is he is a preacher, he's a pastor, and he's going to say, God has given us this land. This is our exodus. We are moving back into this promised land, and it's a justification for killing the 2,000 Cheyenne. So not one of our shining moments in history. Next slide, real quickly. Which takes us to General Philip Sheridan. Sheridan had been one of the young generals during the American Civil War. Sheridan, and Custer, Sherman, all were about the same age coming out of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. They all gained their stars during the American Civil War. Sheridan, when the American Civil War is over, 1866, he takes command of the U.S. forces in the West. And Sheridan, unlike Custer, and I mean, Custer certainly is not, we'll talk about Custer next week, but Sheridan almost immediately says, the way to bring peace to the plains is simply we need to annihilate the buffalo. If we annihilate the buffalo, they're all gone. The Plains Indians in particular will not have sources of food. They will not have robes. They will not have the skins to use for robe. They will not have the sinew to be able to stitch their teepees because they were a migratory people. And if we kill all the buffalo, then we will kill all the Indians. And that becomes his motto. And you'll see it at the bottom of the slide. He says, kill the buffalo and you kill the Indians. He also is credited with having said in a general staff meeting that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, because he is looking totally and completely at westward expansion for settlers coming from the east. So Sheridan's not one of our favorite people. He looks pretty normal in the picture there, but if you read details of his actions on the frontier, he's pretty bloody in the kinds of things that he will do. Next slide. Now, at the same time that's happening, you have people beginning to figure out, there's this land. If we have big ranches, how are we going to get the cattle to market and everything? And I have always loved the name Goodnight Loving Trail. And, it first comes into being in 1866 when, if you think about it, is so close on the heels of the Civil War. So many people have moved westward. You'll notice the map that I'm showing you. Look at what is Indian territory. You can kind of see where the railroad is coming across and everything. And the idea was to create these trails, marked trails, where there would be water accessible along the trail so that you could water the herds, settle the herds down. Hopefully at times there would be canyons where you could contain them at night. One of the great dangers in moving them along the trail were storms with lightning and all those sorts of things, because if you're moving several thousand head of cattle and you have a stampede, we probably all watched some of those movies that had cattle stampedes, but that really was a concern. So you begin to have Western frontiersmen, ranchers, people who understand what needs to be done, attempting to put together, and there will be a number. Goodnight Loving is the very first of those cattle trails. And you can kind of see the route here of where it was going so that they can get up and hit the rail lines, but it allows them to skirt across what is the main part of Texas up through what will eventually be New Mexico. It's not New Mexico at that point, but it gives you this idea of where the cattle trails are, where the more populated areas are, where there's some forest land, and then where there's some other proposed trails that you'll see on this map, which is kind of hard to see, but it gives you this sense of if we can get to the rail lines. So you're going to have all of these cities spring up along the rail lines, because there has to be somewhere, not only for the rail line to come through, there have to be banks, there have to be, general merchandising stores, there have to be places for these cattle ranchers, cowboys, whomever, and the railroad people to eat. There have to be places to entertain them. And they spring up because once those cattle are taken to the railhead, the representatives of the stockyards back east are there. They're buying them so much cash on the head, and you have these guys who have so much money, and a lot of the towns are going to spring up in an attempt to sort of relieve them of that extra cash. So there's where you get some of that image of the wild, wild west with the saloons, the bars, the gunfights, the combination of alcohol and tempers and everything that you end up with a lot of the street fighting. The next slide sort of shows you or mentions to you the Chisholm Trail, I believe. Yeah, the Chisholm Trail, which was Texas to Abilene. So this trail is going to, instead of heading up toward Cheyenne, which is farther west, Abilene is going to be back closer. It's going to be in Kansas Texas to Abilene. And then that's closer to the rail yards and everything. So you see here is one of the historical markers from the Chisholm Trail. And of course, most people probably know the Chisholm Trail most because there were so many songs about it back in the days of when you had all the Western singers. You also have lots of paintings of both of these trails and of the region from Remington, from Catlin, from some of the others that will paint that frontier life. Remington and Catlin both do a good job also of documenting some of those Native American different groups, tribes, that some of which will have disappeared by the time we get to the 20th century. Next slide. So 1868, you have Congress organizing the Wyoming Territory. So, we already have had the Montana Territory being organized. We have the Wyoming Territory being organized. And it's interesting because they happen for two reasons. One, that's incredibly beautiful, rich land, a lot of snow, a lot of cold weather. It's a different type of farming and ranching that will take place there than what you're going to see happening with the breadbasket part of the Midwest and that mid part of the country. But Montana is a territory, Wyoming's a territory. It's also an attempt to begin to establish a northern boundary for us, because there still is the issue with Britain, who has control of Canada, as to where the boundary lines are. And what we forget so often is the Russians are up in that area. The Russians have control of Alaska. They have control of, at one point, all the way down through what today would be Washington State, Oregon, over into part of what would be Idaho. And so we're beginning to try and, from a governmental standpoint, identify our control. In theory, we had control of that land because of the Louisiana Purchase, but the Louisiana Purchase, having come from France, who had gotten it from Spain, and we had it. And even though there had been this expedition and exploration, there wasn't a solid agreement as to where those boundaries are. So we're trying to legislate by introducing territories, bringing territories into the government, that's land that we control. Now, what's interesting is we bring Wyoming in 1868. 1869, while it is still a territory, Wyoming is not a state yet, but while it is still a territory, Wyoming becomes the first territory, the first region of the United States that gives women the right to vote. And when Wyoming comes into the Union, about 10 years later, they will come in as a state from the get-go, with women having the right to vote in state elections and local elections, which is why, of course, they're known as the equality state. As a side note, you may remember from American history that when World War I, when Woodrow Wilson asked for a declaration of war from the joint houses in April of 1917, there was one vote against that out of all of the members of the House and all the members of the Senate. And it was Jeanette Rankin, female, who was the lone representative from the state of Wyoming at a time when women did not have the right to vote federal elections, Jeanette Rankin was representing Wyoming in Congress in the House of Representatives, because those elections are state controlled elections. So I've always loved that kind of tidbit of information. So Wyoming comes in with a little bit of a different look at things. And one of the things that you'll find the founding fathers saying in Wyoming was that you have, there would be no frontier were there not for the frontier women also. And it's kind of fascinating when you look at that. Next slide. (1870). So 1870, we begin, we've had the Second Railroad Construction Act passed, and what you begin to find is attempting, because we're coming from the east, we're coming from the west, eventually we will join in 1869 at Promontory Point in Utah. We need workers coming from the west, and we have immigration at that point, legal immigration coming in by Chinese workers. Chinese workers were willing to work at a lower wage than were white workers. And you'll notice here, they were willing to work for $32.50 a month, where the white workers were being paid for $52 a month. The railroad companies, the Stanford Hills and a lot of those people who are funding the construction of the railroad are looking at who will work hard and who will work the cheapest. They're entrepreneurs. And they begin to employ large numbers of Chinese construction workers. And it's interesting because the Chinese simply are new to the country, immigrant labor, they need jobs, they're wanting to bring their families, all these sorts of things. And it really, because they're willing to work at a lower wage, it erupts into a series of sort of a railroad equivalent of range wars between the Chinese and the white employees, because those who are white believe that they're losing jobs because the Chinese are undercutting them in the wages they're willing to work for. And we're going to have a period of time on the frontier. We're going to have a period of time eventually, and you will see where, there begins to be this resentment toward the Asian Americans. Their language is very different. It is character based. It's not like the Cyrillic alphabet of the Russians, but it is much more character based. It's not an alphabet based language like most of the European languages. Customs are very, very different. Religious beliefs are very, very different. And it sets up a period of some intense hatred and persecution that we will see going on up through the beginning of the 20th century. And then, we'll see maybe raise its head again, even toward Japanese Americans that have been here for several generations in some cases when World War II breaks out. That inability sometimes of citizens to separate those who were Japanese versus those who were Japanese Americans and had been here for a long time. So 1870, and then you'll see in the next slide, as we begin to look at what's happening on the West. So 1878, Congress is wrestling with this idea of how do we deal with this Native American issue? How do we deal with the Native American population? And in 1878, where treaties in the past had been made between Washington and with the different tribes and treated the tribes, whether even with the Cherokee removal, even with the 5 civilized tribes legislation that occurs later with the Cherokee, the Creek, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and others, we dealt with them as a nation, a sovereign nation of people. In 1878, you have, based on political ideology, the passage of the Indian Appropriations Act by Congress. And what it said was, we need to assimilate the natives as best we can. And if we can't, then we need to isolate them onto reservations or whatever. but we are going to deal individually with families. We're going to deal individually with Indians. So you'll notice the 1878 Indian Appropriations Act basically ends the treatment of Indian nations as sovereign nations, and it says they will be treated as individuals and that they are technically wards of the federal government, which means that in many cases the younger members are going to be shipped off to Indian boarding schools. There will be laws passed that will make it illegal to speak in their language, to have their own religious ceremonies, tribal customs, all those things of that nature, which of course increases the gulf between the ability to reason together to solve the differences that we're going to encounter as we encounter each other on the frontier. So, it's a very difficult time during this for Native people, because to be told you can't speak your language, you can't wear your clothing, you have to dress in European style, which is how they refer to the way the Americans dress. You have to dress in white man's clothing, speak white man's language, all of those sorts of things. It really is a very tense time on the Western frontier. Next slide. So in the 1870s, this period that we're talking about right now, there are a number of really significant things that happen, and we're going to try and hit several of those today. And then when we come back next week, we're going to talk about some of the positives. Today, a lot of it sounds very, very negative, and then we'll come back and try and reconcile all of this. Interesting, Cochise, and I think many of us probably grew up watching movies with Cochise. We have this image, we know the Apache, in particular, the Chiricahua Apache, were probably some of the most skilled frontier fighters. They were just much more skilled than some of the tribes in which we encountered that were much easier dealt with. Cochise is probably the most famous of their chiefs. He will in the early 1870s, he will be forced to surrender, and he agrees that he and his people will be moved to a reservation. But when he realizes that they're going to relocate he and his people in what today would be New Mexico, that's not what the original agreement had been. So Cochise escapes, he heads out in the mountains, and there is this sort of guerrilla warfare that will occur between the Apaches attacking settlers, and the settlers are fighting with the Apaches, until finally an agreement is reached where Cochise and the Apaches will be allowed to go back to what they believed were their lands, and that's in Arizona. They were not interested in going to new lands. They simply wanted their spot of their land. New Mexico was more Hopi, Navajo, some of the other tribes. So he really is a fierce warrior, and he gets the American government basically to give in and set aside land in Arizona for them. It is in the 1870s that you have the first piece of legislation to protect 2 million of the acres that today we know as Yellowstone. It doesn't become a national park until later, but we have that first set aside. And the way the legislation reads, it's for the preservation of the trees, the minerals, the landscape, the geological wonders of that region and everything. But it is the first true recognition that we have as a nation that there are wild places in this wild west that perhaps we want to remain wild, that we want to not all of it be just sort of absorbed into the culture and become ranches and farms and all those sorts of things. Interestingly, the third thing that I have on the list for you is, so this campaign against the Cheyenne, to get the Cheyenne to move out of the lands that had historically been their lands. The major scout for the U.S. government's military as they are attempting to move the Cheyenne out was a guy by the name of Bill Cody. He will later become known, of course, as Buffalo Bill Cody, because of his work actually in killing the buffalo and being able to make inroads into those regions. And he will be awarded the Medal of Honor for the military services as he is a scout fighting on the frontier in that campaign against the Cheyenne. That's one of the unusual medals of honor that will be given. And of course, he will, within a couple of years of that award, will retire off of the military frontier and will put together his Wild West show and become quite famous, traveling the nation with, people like Annie Oakley and others, talking about what life is like on the frontier, bringing along with him former Indian chiefs, so that people have a sense. So a lot of our early image of the West is going to come out of what Buffalo Bill Cody is doing. He did indeed have a wonderful collection of native art, even some of the Western painters. If you haven't ever been to Cody, Wyoming, to see the Buffalo Bill Western Heritage Center, there's a good place for you to take a good trip sometime quickly. Number 4 on my list, it's kind of fascinating because, we talked about the destruction of the prairie grasses, and today, if you said, where's the breadbasket of the United States, we would say, oh, it's Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa and that area where there's just miles and miles of agrarian lifestyle there and the agrarian features. But it is Mennonite immigrants who come from Russia, who bring with them a different breed, a different type, a different, almost like a hybrid cross mix wheat, which is called turkey red wheat, because it had been grown historically near the Crimea, near where the Ukraine is today. Georgia and Ukraine were the breadbaskets of that region. So they bring that seed with them, and they begin to transform what at that point had been called the Great American Desert into what will become the Great American Breadbasket. So, every time you eat a good roll, or you think about all of that grain for human consumption, grain to also be used by the cattle yards and everything, we can think about, they're going to use corn more for the cattle, but all of this grain, that transformation begins with Russian Mennonites. Next slide. Number 5, it's during the 1870s that Joseph Glidden comes up with a patent for barbed wire. Now, barbed wire, I grew up with it being called barbed wire because we're in the South, but it was a relatively cheap fencing material. In the East, so often when we fenced, and if you think about this, you will realize it's true. We so often in the East fenced with either wooden posts, wooden planks, or stones, because we would have rock walls, rock fences, mending the wall, mending the fence. That those materials were not as readily available on the frontier, on the plains. And so Glidden comes up with barbed wire, which creates a new problem for the West, because prior to that, you sort of had grazing. Everybody sort of grazed everywhere. You had brands, you registered your brand with the government, and my Rockin' W, I branded all of my cattle during roundup season and everything. Well, once you have barbed wire, then you have people beginning to fence off their tracts of land, which makes it very difficult for people to get cattle to market, because where they had been following those trails across open plains, you're now finding that those lands are being fenced off, and we'll have a series of barbed wars because of that access to water, access to the thoroughfares to get the cattle to the railheads. The other thing that is a real problem is this is going to also contribute to the wars between cattle farmers, cattle ranchers, and sheep farmers. Huge controversy in the West over that, because sheep farmers, and I don't know if any of you have ever raised sheep or anything, but one of the problems with cattle eat the pasture, but they leave some of the grass. They leave the roots. Sheep, as a rule, are much more destructive to pasture land. So you're going to have a series of frontier wars between the ranchers and the sheep herders. And there are lots of books out there about that. There's also several movies on that also. Number 6, I threw in just, the poor Lakota. You have the Lakota that have been moved. In many cases, they were Plains Indians, Lakota, part of the Sioux tribe, but they have been moved up into the Black Hills. And then you've got in 1868 a treaty signed that gives them, it's the Fort Laramie Treaty, but it gives them control of the Black Hills all the way across in what today would be North Dakota, all the way across into Montana and everything. Well, in the 1870s, they discover gold in the Black Hills. In fact, I think there's a brand of jewelry that's Black Hills gold or something, even still today. So there's an announcement that gold has been discovered in the Black Hills. And even though there's a treaty giving the Lakota control of that land, what you have is the federal government stepping in and basically working with the miners to attempt to drive the Lakota from their land. So what it's an interesting period of time because the Lakota chiefs will be ordered by the U.S. federal government to all go to their reservations. And so you have Lakota leaders like Sitting Bull, probably recognize these names, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and others who refuse because this is their land. They're not wanting to go to these new reservations that have been designated for them. So you have General Sheridan, who's going to order General Crook to sort of gather them up, and others, and they are to gather them up, march them to their reservations by process of a combined assault. You're going to have the different U.S. armies coming in together and then forcing them to move. Well, what you're going to have is Crazy Horse and about 500 of his warriors are going to surprise General Crook's troops at Rosebud River, forces General Crook and his men to retreat, and then about 2 weeks later, George Armstrong Custer, who is part of General Terry's forces, are going to discover where he is on the Little Bighorn. And Terry orders Custer to drive the enemy down the Little Bighorn toward where General Gibbon's forces are. And they were going to be waiting for them at the mouth of the Little Bighorn River, and then they will be able to force all of them together. And of course, we know what happens at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And what Custer does is, with his men, they go into the area in this attempt to drive them into General Terry, into the mouth of the river where General Terry's men will capture them. And he realizes, General Custer does, that he's outnumbered 4-1. You have hundreds of Lakota warriors who overwhelm his troops and kills them to the last man. The battle, of course, we know today is the Custer's Last Stand, Battle of Little Bighorn. When the news of that battle hits the Eastern press, the newspapers in Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Richmond and other places, it absolutely shocks the nation. And what you have are huge recruitments of troops who want to join the military and help hunt down the Lakota and force them to surrender. And ultimately, most of them will be forced into surrender, be forced to the reservation. Sitting Bull eludes capture. He actually leads part of his band across the border into Colorado. But it's just, it's one of those situations where the treaty obviously has not been honored because now gold has been discovered in that area. Deadwood, which is probably one of the most notorious of the Western frontier towns, springs up during all of this. So for those of you that have heard of Deadwood, maybe watched the series Deadwood or have read any of the literature, that all comes about during this period of time when you've got the military in conflict with the Lakota Sioux. Okay, next slide. We're going to move even quicker.
Yeah, Linda, we got about 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay, we are going to stop right here at 1877. So one of the things I haven't talked about much is the religious diversity that you're going to find in the Midwest. I mentioned the Mennonites coming in. Probably the largest group that will have the greatest impact is going to be the Latter-day Saints, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, who had formed earlier. Book of Mormon as their guide, had been persecuted in Nauvoo, Illinois, and then had moved with Joseph Smith first, Brigham Young later as their leader. The Mormon Trail, and you can still follow parts of the Mormon Trail. One of the things fascinating about it is a lot of them moved with hand carts, with their goods all in hand carts, and walked the whole way. You can still see the ruts in some places from the Mormon Trail. But anyway, they get into the Utah territory, primarily take it because of the Great Salt Lake. No one else wanted it, thinking the land was all contaminated because of that. So it's worthless land. So the government was willing for the Mormons to take that land, and they are able to fashion a society and a city and everything in that region. Tremendous amount of conflict over the idea of polygamy. Brigham Young dies in 1877. 1879, the U.S. court upholds the constitutionality of anti-polygamy laws. The Mormons had argued it on First Amendment freedom of religion within the First Amendment, but the U.S. Supreme Court is going to say that's not true. And we will stop there until next week, and then we'll pick back up and talk about the West. And I'll just hold my gunslingers until then. I was so ready to talk about John Wesley Hardin, and maybe a little Billy the Kid. Clay Allison is probably my favorite. Hardin is the worst. 40, love to claim 40 men notched into his gun that he killed because they deserved to die. They were all justifiable homicides.
Well, we want to thank everybody for coming and listening and participating, and we'll see all you cowpokes back next week at same time, as I used to say on the Western, same time, same channel.
Same time.
Be with us.